can call him a king, a conqueror, a man who reshaped history. But the truth is that Henry VIII died like a rotting beast draped in royal silk. In his final days, he was no longer the monarch who made Europe tremble. No longer the man who broke the church itself just to marry one woman. He was a living corpse, devoured by oozing wounds, visions that clawed at his sanity, and the ghosts of 6 women, women who had once loved him, feared him, pleaded with him for mercy, and in the end, had bled beneath the executioner's blade at his command. No one truly knows whether those ghosts were demons, hallucinations, or the raw form of guilt given shape, but one thing was certain: Henry did not die alone. He died surrounded by the memories of every woman he destroyed. It began like a fairy tale. In the year 1509, at the age of 18, Henry was crowned king. He was tall, striking, full of charm, obsessed with sport, music, and dancing. A Venetian ambassador once described him as the handsomest man he had ever seen. Henry loved Catherine of Aragon, an intelligent and courageous woman who ruled England in his absence when he went to war in France. He called her the heart of my heart. Even in public, even after decades of marriage, for 20 years, they seemed like an ideal royal couple. Until Henry's obsession with a male heir began to poison everything. By the year 1527, Catherine was 42 past childbearing age. To Henry, that was an omen, a punishment, a curse. Then came Anne Boleyn, young, sharp, and wary of kings. She had watched her sister be discarded, like refuse after being Henry's mistress. Anne gave him a choice: marriage or nothing. To keep her, Henry broke England away from the Catholic Church, declared himself head of a new church, dissolved ancient monasteries, and sent beloved friends like Thomas More and John Fisher to the scaffold. He shattered lives in the name of love, and the blood kept flowing. Anne had 3 miscarriages, including 1 male child. After the last, Henry stared at her, not as a lover, but as a failure. In the year 1536, Anne was charged with adultery, incest, and treason, accusations built on lies. She was beheaded by a French sword. Henry heard the cannon that marked her death and, before her body even cooled, and became engaged to Jane Seymour the next day. Jane gave birth to Edward in October of the year 1537 and died 12 days later. Henry mourned her deeply, truly, but not enough to change. He married again, Anne of Cleves, whom he rejected for political and personal reasons. He claimed she smelled bad, looked worse, and ended the marriage after 6 months. Then came Catherine Howard, a 19-year-old girl, radiant and energetic, who reminded Henry of who he once had been. But she, too, was soon accused of adultery, locked in the Tower. She screamed for mercy down the haunted halls of Hampton Court before being dragged away to execution in the year 1542. By then, Henry was no longer a man. He was a monster. His legs were ulcerated and stank of rotting flesh. His weight had ballooned so drastically that servants needed pulleys to move him. His mood swung from laughter to rages to weeping in minutes. Catherine Parr, his 6th wife, survived only by never opposing him, by becoming as invisible as she was wise. And then came the year of reckoning 1547. Henry knew he was dying, confined to his bed at Whitehall Palace. He weighed more than 300 pounds. His body was literally decaying. But the true horror was not in the flesh, it was in the mind. He began speaking to no one, whispering names into dark corners, calling out to Anne, to Catherine, to Jane, to Catherine. The royal attendants, recording what they saw, wrote that he seemed to be begging forgiveness from empty air, reaching out with trembling hands to faces only he could see. And then he died, alone, drenched in sweat, drowning in remorse, his body leaking pus, his breath heavy with rot, his final visions filled with the ghosts of the women who once loved him and died because of him. But history did not end there. The son he had murdered 2 wives to obtain young Edward became king at the age of 9 and died at the age of 15. The crown passed to Mary, daughter of the wife Henry had cast aside, without an army, without vengeance, without bloodshed. These women triumphed, not through power, but through memory, through time, through the pages of history, where they are remembered with compassion. And Henry VIII is forever branded not as a glorious king, but as the man who killed everyone who ever truly loved him, long before the stench of rotting flesh clung to the sheets of Whitehall, before the blood of queens stained the marble floors of the Tower, and before the name Henry was whispered with fear instead of admiration. There lived a prince so dazzling that even his enemies paused to marvel. It was said that when Henry, second son of the Tudor king, entered a room, the chandeliers seemed to gleam a little brighter. His laughter carried across courtyards like music. His stride was the stride of a man who believed the world had been stitched for his feet alone. And his mind sharp, putic, hungry, drank in knowledge and philosophy as quickly as it drank wine and praise. He was not supposed to rule. That duty had fallen to his elder brother, Arthur, who was sickly but dutiful, married off young to a Spanish princess named Catherine. And yet, when death took Arthur, as it so often took Tudor sons, the line of fate twisted like ivy. And suddenly the prince in velvet became the heir, and then the king. When he was crowned in the year 1509, England exhaled. A golden boy now sat upon the throne, 18 years old, standing over 6 feet tall, with chestnut hair that shimmered in the sun and legs that danced in tournaments like a knight from a storybook. Henry was everything a country bruised by war and uncertainty could want. His subjects adored him. Courtiers swooned. Foreign dignitaries whispered that England had become a rival to Rome, not through steel or scripture, but through one man who seemed carved by the gods to wear a crown. And at his side, from the very beginning, stood Catherine, the Spanish bride once meant for Arthur, now queen to Henry. Their union, once questioned by priests and scholars who fretted over biblical laws and political optics, had been smoothed over with papal blessings and crowned with ceremony. But Catherine was no shadow queen. She was strong, devout, and beloved by the people. When Henry rode to France to prove his mettle on the battlefield, it was Catherine who ruled England with steel beneath her silks. She crushed rebellions, signed proclamations, and prayed for victory. Her hands calloused from worry and her eyes ever watchful. She bore Henry many children, but one by one, they withered. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who died before they could be christened. Only one child, Mary, survived. A daughter, intelligent, proud, pious, but to Henry, tragically female. The palace grew quieter each year. Catherine's womb stayed still. And Henry, who once held her close in public, who called her my heart, in open court, began to drift. He smiled less, danced less. His eyes, once only for her, started to wander. The glory of youth was beginning to dull, and with it came whispers. Was God punishing him? Had marrying his brother's widow been a sin too great for a crown to cover? And in this fog of doubt and spiritual dread, Henry saw her. Anne. She was unlike any lady he had known. Sharp-tongued and clever. Educated and deliberate. With eyes that didn't bow. Anne Boleyn had watched her sister Mary be taken as the king's mistress. Used. Discarded. And silenced. She refused to be the next page in that tired chapter. She wrote back when Henry sent gifts. She delayed. She vanished from court, just long enough to be missed. And she told him, not in poetry, but in clear, cold terms, if you want me. You must marry me. No crown. No Anne. And so began the unraveling. Henry, obsessed, now not only with Anne, but with his desire for a son, declared war on the very church that had anointed him. He demanded an annulment from Catherine. The Pope refused. Cardinals pleaded. Bishops warned. Thomas More, his friend and mentor, a man who had once cradled his children, fell to his knees and begged him to reconsider. But Henry's pride burned hotter than faith. He broke with Rome. He proclaimed himself the supreme head of the Church of England. He dissolved the monasteries, tearing down the stones that had stood for centuries. His men looted ancient abbeys, dragged monks into the streets, and auctioned off relics as if they were trinkets from a play. But none of that mattered to Henry. Not the relics. Not the friends who wept at his betrayal. Not the council of old allies now rotting in cells. He had Anne. And he had hope, in secret letters. He called her my entirely beloved. He wrote of her eyes, her wit, her mind. She fascinated him. For the first time in his life, he was denied something, and that denial bloomed into obsession. When they finally married, he believed the heavens would reward him. Anne was with child, and Henry was certain it would be a boy. He built her a coronation, fit for an empress. But fate, ever cruel, placed a mirror before him instead. Anne gave birth to a girl. They named her Elizabeth, and she was healthy and strong. But Henry barely looked at her. His disappointment was thunderous. Anne was pregnant again not long after, but the pressure suffocated her. She miscarried once, then again, and in the month of January, in the year 1536, she lost a third child. It was a boy. Henry's eyes turned cold. The man who had rewritten the laws of heaven for her now looked at her as if she were the devil's gift. Anne saw the same expression Catherine once saw. The weariness, the distance, the silent damnation. She knew she would not survive it. Henry had already begun to court Jane Seymour. A pale shadow of Anne, quiet, docile, unthreatening. But for Henry to marry again, Anne had to be gone. Not just divorced, erased. He had her watched. He studied every glance she gave to another man. He heard gossip, rumor, laughter in the halls, and he made it all fit the story he needed. Adultery, incest, treason, charges built not on truth, but on convenience. Her own brother was accused. Her household was dismantled. Anne was taken to the Tower of London, the same place where Henry's own mother had once grieved. She was 28 years old. On the 19th day of May, she knelt before the executioner. She smiled. She prayed for the king's health. And then the sword fell. Henry did not attend. He waited in his palace for the signal, a cannon blast across the city. When he heard it, He did not weep. He did not pray. He went to Jane and proposed. The man who had once been a prince of light and promise was now something else. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the velvet and steel, beneath the feast tables and royal scrolls, a crack had formed that would never mend. Henry had crossed a threshold. He had killed, not in war, not in justice, but in disappointment, and something old and ancient, whether God, fate, or guilt, began to follow him after that day. Because sometimes it is not the blade that kills a man. It is what he allows to rot and fester within him after it falls. It should have been a triumph. After all the tears, all the broken marriages, all the prayers whispered in the dead of night by wives, hoping their wombs would not fail them. Finally, on the 12th day of October, in the year 1537, a son was born to the King of England. The bells rang out across the city, with the kind of ferocity usually reserved for war victories. Church choirs broke into spontaneous hymn. Courtiers knelt in thanks. And in a candlelit chamber filled with the stale scent of sweat and the copper tang of blood, Henry stood beside the cradle of his third child, Edward, as Prince of Wales, and finally allowed himself to believe that God had answered. But like everything Henry touched, the price came swiftly, cruelly, and soaked in pain. Jane Seymour, the woman he had married the very day after Anne Boleyn's execution, had done what her predecessors could not. She had delivered a healthy boy. She had done it quietly, without rebellion, without argument, without fire. Jane was gentle where Catherine had been proud. She was soft where Anne had been sharp. She never tried to shape Henry, only to please him. And so he loved her. Or at least what she represented: obedience, purity, reward. But Jane, whose body had broken itself to give him a son, did not live to see her child walk, talk, or call her mother. Within 12 days of Edward's birth, she was dead. Fever, infection, too much blood lost. Her skin grew cold, even as the kingdom lit bonfires in celebration. Henry wore black for 3 months. He spoke of Jane as the one true wife. He had her buried with the honors of a queen, and later demanded that he be laid beside her in death. And perhaps, for a flickering moment, grief softened him. But grief is not redemption. Not when it comes to kings who kill. The birth of Edward should have been a new beginning. But instead, it marked the start of a slow and irreversible rot, both literal and spiritual. Not long after Jane's death, the wound on Henry's left leg reopened. A wound first inflicted years earlier during a jousting tournament that had left him unconscious for 2 hours. Back then, he had woken up, shaken off the pain, and returned to his courtly splendor. But now, the wound refused to heal. It swelled. It split. It oozed. Physicians tried poultices, wine compresses, ointments made from moss and silver, and frog's blood. Nothing worked. The king's leg became a source of horror. Servants gagged when changing the bandages. Courtiers whispered about the smell. Rumors spread that his own dogs turned away when he entered a room. But worse than the pain was what it began to represent. The wound was no longer just on his body. It had become part of who he was, an outward sign of the curse he refused to name aloud. He limped through the palace halls, dragging not just his ruined leg, but the ghosts of the women he had buried. Every step left something behind: hope, patience, the last remnants of that golden prince from the year 1509. And yet, despite it all, Henry still believed he could start again. By the year 1539, he had been a widower for 2 years. His son, Edward, was a pale, solemn child who rarely laughed. His court urged him to remarry for diplomatic reasons. He agreed. And so, into England came Anne of Cleves, a princess from a small German duchy. Selected through painted portraits and treaty drafts, she arrived with formality and grace, but the moment Henry saw her in person, his face twisted. He called her a Flanders mare. He claimed she smelled of rot. He said her skin was coarse, her accent grating, her body repulsive. But the truth was not in her. It was in him. He was no longer the man of his portraits. And her presence was a mirror, a reminder that his charm had withered, that he could no longer mount a horse without help, that women might look at him now with duty instead of desire. Anne of Cleves became the bride he never touched, the wife in name only. Their marriage lasted 6 months before being annulled. She was spared the axe, given a pension, and allowed to live in quiet comfort, perhaps the luckiest of his queens. But Henry was not content to end the chapter there. Within weeks, he had found someone new. She was young, too young. Catherine Howard, barely 19 years old, was everything Anne Boleyn had once been: lively, flirty, sharp with glances, and soft with laughter. Henry was nearly 50, bloated, aching, and unable to walk unaided. But when he looked at Catherine, he saw youth itself, and mistook it for salvation. She was Anne Boleyn's cousin, a poetic twist of fate he either ignored or delighted in. He showered her with jewels and gowns. He called her Rose without a thorn. She danced. She smiled. She played the part of a fairy queen. But she was no Anne. And Henry was no longer a man who could protect what he desired. Catherine had grown up in the chaotic household of her dowager step-grandmother, where young men came and went with little oversight. Before ever meeting Henry, she had known affection, perhaps even love with men her own age. Francis Derham, her childhood companion; Henry Minox, her music tutor. Later, at court, she grew close to Thomas Culpeper, a favorite of the king. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was rebellion. Maybe it was just the desperate attempt of a teenage girl to remember what happiness felt like. But it was enough. By the year 1541, the whispers had reached Henry's ears. He flew into a rage that dwarfed anything he had felt before. This was no longer about loyalty. It was about humiliation. The old king had been made a fool by a child. He ordered interrogations, torture. Confessions were ripped from flesh and fear. Catherine was arrested, dragged to the Tower, locked in the same rooms Anne Boleyn had once paced. And on one chilling night, at Hampton Court, she broke free from her guards and ran down the hallway now called the Haunted Gallery, screaming for the king to hear her, screaming for her life. He never came. On the 13th day of February, in the year 1542, Catherine Howard was beheaded. She had been queen for 16 months. She was 19 years old. Her final words, it is said, were a prayer for the man who had ordered her death. The crack in Henry widened into a chasm. He claimed to be the victim, the one betrayed, the one women always lied to. But the truth lingered in every corner of his rotting palace. 2 wives executed, 3 dead, 1 cast aside, 1 child prince growing thinner by the day. The heavens had not rewarded him. They had marked him. And still, the king did not stop. He did not beg forgiveness. He did not rest. He limped onward, dragging the chains of his own making, unaware that the shadows behind him were growing sharper, watching, waiting, whispering his name. By the time Henry VIII met Catherine Parr, England no longer saw a man. It saw a shadow made of flesh. A monarch who reeked of decay. A legend that refused to die, though death was already gnawing through his bones. The golden prince who once dazzled ambassadors with his beauty and grace had swollen into something grotesque. His leg was so diseased that pus seeped through layers of bandage, and the smell of it filled entire corridors. He could no longer climb stairs, no longer mount a horse, no longer even kneel to pray. Servants lifted him with ropes and pulleys, as if he were a sack of grain. The man who had once rewritten God's law for love now spent his nights groaning in pain, his body betraying him inch by inch. But worse than the rot in his body was the corruption in his mind. The voices of the dead had begun to hum in the corners of his room. Soft at first, then clearer, more familiar, almost tender. Catherine Parr entered this world of shadows, not as a naive bride, but as a woman who understood that marriage to a king could be a form of suicide. She had already been widowed twice. She knew how to move through rooms full of men without stepping on egos. She could quote scripture as easily as she could flatter. And she possessed the rare instinct to sense danger before it spoke. When Henry's eye turned toward her, she trembled not from desire, but from the knowledge of what that gaze had meant for the women before her. Yet she could not refuse him. No one refused Henry. To deny him was treason, and to accept him was to lie down beside death itself. The wedding took place in the summer of the year 1543. Quiet and uneasy, the courtiers smiled. The choirs sang. And in the midst of the ceremony, Henry's leg began to leak through his hose, staining the fabric crimson. The priests looked away. Catherine kept her eyes on the altar. From that moment on, she understood her role, not as queen, but as caretaker, nurse, and strategist. She learned the rhythm of his tempers, when to speak and when to vanish, when to laugh and when to fall silent. She read to him from the Bible during the long nights when pain made him curse God. And sometimes, in the dark, she thought she saw him flinch at a name, Anne, or Catherine, or Jane, as if he feared that saying it aloud would make a ghost appear at the foot of the bed. Henry liked to think of himself as in control. But Catherine quickly saw that he was haunted by everything he had destroyed. The courtiers walked on eggshells around him. One wrong word could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. He accused trusted friends of treason for nothing more than a sigh or a glance. He ordered executions, then fell into sobbing fits afterward, insisting that his victims had forced his hand. Catherine saw how the court itself had become a reflection of his decaying body, festered with fear, swollen with flattery, poisoned by silence. And yet, she managed something miraculous. She kept him calm. When his temper rose like thunder, she soothed him with reason. When his ministers whispered of rebellion, she reminded him of mercy. When the leg throbbed so violently that he shouted at the walls, she sat beside him, pressing cool cloths against the wound. Even when the smell made her dizzy, she risked her own life more than once. Her interest in religious reform drew suspicion, and at one point, Henry's advisors convinced him that she was heretic enough to burn. He signed the warrant for her arrest, and then forgot about it in a fit of fever. When the guards came to take her away, she knelt beside his chair, wept, and said that her only wish had been to learn from him. Flattered, the old king wept too, tore up the warrant, and declared that God himself had sent her to him. For a few weeks after that, the palace slept in peace. But peace in Henry's world was never more than a pause before the next scream. By the year 1544, his paranoia had become an empire of its own. He saw conspiracies in every shadow, a poison in every goblet, betrayal in every smile. The wound on his leg deepened, tunneling into the flesh until the physicians whispered of gangrene. They lanced it daily, and the pus ran like wax from a melting candle. The stench of him was said to carry 30 feet. Courtiers fainted in his presence. He took to wearing jewels and heavy furs to mask his disfigurement. But nothing could hide what he had become. He still commanded armies, still signed decrees, still roared his way through council chambers, but the roars no longer sounded like power. They sounded like pain. At night, the ghosts came back. Sometimes he woke screaming, clutching the sheets as though a hand had reached from beneath them. He shouted at empty air, arguing with voices that no one else could hear. Servants swore they saw him holding conversations with invisible figures, his expression soft and almost childlike. Once, Catherine entered his chamber and found him staring at a chair across the room, whispering to it. When she asked who he spoke to, he said, "She forgave me." Then he began to weep. After that, she stopped asking questions. Still, she stayed. Through the winters that smelled of vinegar and pus, through the summers that made his sores bubble beneath the heat, through the sermons he made her recite to keep his conscience quiet. She stayed. She even helped reconcile him with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, the living reminders of the women he had cast aside or killed. She convinced him to restore them to the line of succession, and for a brief, trembling moment, it seemed like grace. It seemed like maybe, just maybe, he would find peace before death came. But the body is honest, even when the soul lies. By the year 1546, the infection in his leg had reached the bone. His eyes, once bright as sapphires, sank into folds of fat. His tongue swelled. His teeth blackened. His breath reeked of decay. He sat on his throne like a corpse propped upright, the jewel of his crown glinting dully above a face that no longer resembled the man from the portraits. He accused Catherine of hiding things from him again, and she lived each day as though the axe was already swinging above her neck. She had learned that survival meant never being right, only useful. Sometimes, when the palace went quiet, she would walk the corridors alone. She would pause before the painted faces of the women who had come before her. Catherine of Aragon, steadfast and sorrowful. Anne Boleyn, defiant and doomed. Jane Seymour, sweet and dead too soon. Anne of Cleves, smiling faintly, her eyes distant. Catherine Howard, laughing. Forever 19. And then, her own reflection in the glass, alive. For now, the last queen of a man who had forgotten how to love. As Henry's health sank further, the council began to prepare for the inevitable. They spoke in whispers about succession, about the boy, Edward, about the dangers of another child king. Henry refused to hear them. He still fancied himself the ruler of men, the chosen of God, but he could barely lift a cup without shaking. The great banquets that had once defined his reign had turned into silent meals where he picked at food with trembling fingers. Sometimes, when the pain dulled for an hour, he would talk about his youth, how he had hunted through the forests of Richmond, how he had danced all night under the torches, how women used to look at him with fire in their eyes. And then he would look down at his ruined legs and mutter, "I was beautiful once." Catherine listened. She always listened. That was her magic and her curse. She understood that kings die like any other man, alone, afraid, and surrounded by the echoes of their sins. She watched him fade, and though she had learned to sleep beside him, she never forgot that the man breathing beside her was a relic of cruelty and fire. The heart that beat under that bloated chest had once ordered the death of wives and friends without blinking. And yet, in his final days, it fluttered like a trapped bird. Desperate for forgiveness, it no longer deserved. When the bells finally tolled for midnight on one of those endless winter nights, Catherine sat by his bedside and held his hand, careful not to disturb the infected leg beneath the sheets. Henry's eyes fluttered open. He looked at her as if he didn't know her name. He whispered something too faint for her to hear, and then fell back into the heavy breathing of a man running from his dreams. Somewhere in the palace, the wind slipped through the halls, and for just a moment, Catherine thought she heard laughter, the kind that sounded young, familiar, and female. It came from the direction of the portrait room. She did not go to see, because she already knew which ghost had been laughing. By the time the year turned to 1546, and sleep had abandoned Henry VIII, like every soul who had once loved him, the palace, grand and echoing, became not a home but a cage of stone, where the king lay propped like a breathing corpse. The bed was wide, draped in velvet, but no luxury could hide what was happening to the man who slept within it. The wound on his leg had turned black. Gangrene crept through the flesh like something alive, something patient. Each night, his groans leaked through the walls. Each morning, servants wept silently as they peeled the soiled linens from his bed and soaked his leg in vinegar. Herbs and prayers. Nothing helped. The wound did not close. It only widened, as if the very earth beneath him had opened its mouth and begun to swallow its king piece by piece. And still he did not sleep. When the windows darkened and the candles burned low, Henry did not drift into dreams. He fought them, fought the silence, fought the shapes in the corners that didn't move until he looked away. The pain in his leg throbbed with the heartbeat of something ancient, the fire in his gut, the pressure in his skull, the heaviness in his chest. They pulsed in rhythm with the memories he tried to forget. But it was the stillness that frightened him most, because it was in the stillness that they came. He began to speak aloud at night. At first, whispers, then louder. Sometimes he pleaded, sometimes he argued. His voice echoed down the hallways, waking the guards who stood outside his chamber. They heard him calling out names. Catherine, he moaned. Anne, forgive me. At times, he raged. Lies, I did what I had to do. Servants rushed in more than once thinking assassins had crept into the room, only to find the king alone, eyes wide open, staring at the canopy above him as if it were the ceiling of a crypt. No one dared ask him what he saw, but they all knew. The ghosts had come. By day, he was still King of England, still Henry Tudor, still the supreme head of the church. He could still thunder commands, demand gold, threaten ministers. But even in daylight, the shadows clung to him like a second cloak. He began to forget people's names. He screamed at his attendants for imagined betrayals, then clutched their hands like a frightened child. The smell from his body had grown unbearable. Incense was burned day and night, not in prayer, but to disguise the scent of rot. They stuffed herbs into his mattress, into the drapes, even into his pillows, but the smell always returned. It clung to his clothing, his sheets, even the floor. The palace itself began to smell like death. And then came the final purge. In a burst of paranoia that some claimed was divine madness, and others knew was guilt made flesh, Henry turned against the very church he had created. He ordered the execution of Anne Askew, a young woman accused of heresy simply for believing that Christ lived spiritually, not physically. In the Eucharist, she was tortured so brutally on the rack that her body split, and when they burned her alive at Smithfield, she could not even stand. They carried her to the stake in a chair. As the flames consumed her, she looked toward the palace and sang a hymn. Henry watched it from a window. He did not flinch. That night, he did not sleep. He lay awake, sweating. His leg oozed. His breathing rattled. And when his physician entered the room to change the bandages, he found the king weeping, talking to no one, shaking his head as if to silence voices that refused to leave him be. He said Anne's name again, and Catherine's, and Jane's, and then, she's here. She's watching. In the weeks that followed, the servants began to whisper. Some claimed they saw movement at the far end of the corridor when no one else was there. Some claimed that the Queen's apartments had grown cold, even in the warmth of summer. One night, a maid ran screaming from the hallway outside Henry's chambers, babbling about a woman in a white nightgown walking silently toward the royal doors. They found no one, but the king did not ask what she had seen. He already knew, and still, he would not die. He grew heavier. His face ballooned until his eyes vanished into folds of fat. His neck thickened into his shoulders. He could not bathe without help, could not dress himself, could not walk more than a few steps without the aid of servants and pulleys. He rarely left his bed. Ministers brought scrolls and treaties to him where he lay, half reclining in pain, barely able to hold a pen. He signed death warrants with trembling hands and smeared ink. Sometimes, he signed the same name twice. He had become a mountain of flesh that breathed hate, regret, and delusion. He thought he was still in control. He thought he still ruled. But England had begun to mourn him while he still lived. Catherine Parr remained beside him, ever patient, ever quiet, her eyes trained on survival. She prayed with him. She listened to his stories. She nursed his temper with scripture. But in the private hours, she avoided the long mirrors in the hallway, because if she looked, she feared she might see the faces of the others behind her. It was not just Henry who couldn't sleep anymore. And then, on a night in early January, in the year 1547, Henry's body began to fail faster than usual. His eyes grew glassy. His voice turned hoarse. He did not call for Catherine. He did not call for his doctors. He began, instead, to call for the dead. Servants wrote in their records that he reached toward corners of the room, that he smiled at no one, that he whispered over and over again, "I'm sorry." One scribe claimed that he heard the king say, "It was supposed to be different. I loved them. I loved all of them." But history remembered otherwise. And the ghosts, if they were listening, did not answer. When the physicians told Catherine and the Privy Council that the end was near, no one wept. No one prayed aloud. No one dared move too quickly, for fear that his breath might catch one last time and lash out like a whip. He still signed documents. He still gave orders, but his words no longer made sense. He asked for people long dead. He mumbled Latin phrases out of order. He screamed when the light in the room shifted, as if something had stepped between him and the sun. And still, he would not sleep. Because kings may command armies, rewrite churches, and marry queens, but no man, not even Henry Tudor, it can escape the reckoning that comes in the final hours. It is not the crown that judges a man, but the silence he cannot bear. And in that silence, Henry began to vanish, not all at once, but slowly, minute by minute, until there was nothing left but the sound of his own breath and the ghosts who had been waiting since the day he put a sword to Anne Boleyn's neck. The palace at Whitehall had become a tomb long before the body inside it turned cold. The tapestries still hung. The fires still burned. The footmen still marched in silence past the crimson doors, but the man they served was already half gone. Henry VIII. Once the radiant sun around which the kingdom revolved, now lay in the hollow center of the world he had burned down with his own hands. His limbs had swollen, grotesquely. His eyes were sunken, and the stench that leaked from his bandages was no longer that of a wound. It was the scent of the grave, crawling early beneath his skin. He could no longer rise from his bed. He could no longer walk. He could barely eat without choking. But he could still speak. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing of all. Because now, at the end, he started to speak the truth. It came in gasps, half phrases, sobbing fits that turned to laughter, and laughter that turned to cries for help. There were no formal declarations, no royal proclamations signed with wax and gold. Instead, there were confessions made in the dark, to no one, or to everyone, or to the shadows gathering at the foot of the bed. The servants who stood watch through the night recorded their king's descent in neat Latin, trembling with every word. He spoke to the dead, not once, not twice, but constantly. He called for Catherine, the queen he had cast aside, begged her to forgive the years. He left her rotting alone in the draughty castle at Kimbleton. He whispered to Anne, not as the furious tyrant who once signed her death warrant, but as a man whose heart had shattered the day her blood stained the scaffold. He wept for Jane, the only one he claimed to have truly loved, and whose death in childbirth he now called a punishment I will never outrun. He even said the name of Catherine Howard, again and again, like a curse or a prayer, remembering her scream in the haunted corridor, the night she begged for mercy he never gave. At first, the court tried to dismiss it. Fever, dreams. They said, delirium. But Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the man who had been with Henry through nearly all his crimes and coronations, and knew better. He stayed by the king's bedside in those final nights and witnessed what the others feared to admit. The King of England was not dying from infection alone. He was dying of guilt. And it was not a gentle death. There were nights when Henry could no longer tell which century he lived in. He shouted for Thomas More, then for the Pope, then for his father, Henry VII. He asked why his son Edward never smiled. He accused Mary of being a witch. He demanded that Elizabeth be brought to him in the middle of the night, only to forget her name once she arrived. He mistook Catherine Parr for Jane, then for Anne, then for Catherine, and then for his own mother. The physicians began sedating him with poppy and wine, but it only deepened the nightmare. He slept for hours, then awoke screaming, soaked in sweat, clawing at his sheets as though something were pulling him down into the mattress. One night, the guards outside his chamber heard him whispering again. At first, it was soft like prayer, then louder. Get out, he said. You don't belong here. I said I was sorry. I said I was sorry. A crash followed, a tray thrown, a candle knocked over. When they rushed in, they found him shaking violently, pointing at the far corner of the room, but there was nothing there. Only shadows. Cranmer, exhausted, begged Henry to make peace with God. He urged him to confess, to pray, to name Christ as his Savior, before it was too late. And Henry, for a moment, seemed ready. He gripped Cranmer's hand. He opened his mouth, but instead of scripture, he asked one question: "Do they forgive me?" The archbishop said yes. Of course, yes. God is mercy. God is grace. But Henry didn't mean God. He meant them, the women, and then he fell back against the pillows and began to mumble their names again, in a loop that made the room feel colder. Like winter had crept in through the cracks in the stone and built a nest inside his chest. Catherine. Anne. Jane. Anne. Catherine. Catherine. Over and over. Their names, like rosary beads made of regret. He stopped eating. He barely drank. He refused to see anyone but Cranmer and Catherine Parr. The council assembled outside his door each morning, debating when and how to announce the coming death of their monarch. But inside, the king was already far away, somewhere between memory and nightmare. Between the throne and the tomb, there were reports unconfirmed, and yet impossible to ignore, that strange things began to happen in those final nights. A page swore he saw a figure standing by the fire, cloaked in black, whispering in Latin. A maid claimed she heard footsteps in the hallway when no one had passed. A night watchman fainted after seeing what he described as a woman in white, holding a baby wrapped in bloodied cloth, drifting silently toward the royal chamber. No one believed them. Everyone believed them. Because how could they not? 6 women had passed through Henry's life, and none of them had left quietly. The sins of kings are long, deep rivers, and they flood when the body can no longer hold them back. Henry had thought himself untouchable. He had moved heaven and earth. He had destroyed monasteries, rewritten laws, rewritten God himself to suit his will. He had married who he pleased, crowned and uncrowned, killed and wept and married again. He had lived not as a man, but as a force. But now, lying beneath a velvet canopy that smelled of old rot and spilled ink, he was nothing more than a dying animal, choking on the weight of what he had done. On the night of January the 27th, in the year 1547, he stopped speaking. His lips moved, but no sound came. He gripped Cranmer's hand. The archbishop asked him to squeeze if he believed in Christ. Henry's fingers twitched, and then they went still. The servants backed away. The fire sputtered low. The wind outside howled, as if it knew. Henry VIII was dead, but the ghosts remained. When the dawn finally broke over Whitehall Palace on that frozen morning of January the 28th, in the year 1547, a strange quiet settled over England. The bells did not toll immediately, for even the men tasked with announcing the death of their king hesitated to believe that the monstrous breathing from the royal chamber had truly stopped. Servants waited for the next groan, the next order, the next fit of rage. But the silence stayed. The sun rose pale through the fog, and the once mighty Henry Tudor lay motionless. His swollen hands stiffened around the sheets that had trapped him through his final night. His mouth hung open slightly, as though he had tried to speak one last word and never managed to find it. Some said he had been calling for Anne. Others swore they heard him murmur the name Jane. But no one could be sure. The only sound that remained was the faint ticking of a clock in the hallway, measuring out the seconds between his power and his oblivion. The council gathered in haste. Outside the palace, Londoners went about their morning unaware that the man who had ruled their lives through terror, decree, and legend had turned to meat and shadow. It was decided that the news would be kept secret for several days, to prepare for a smooth transition of power. Henry's son, Edward, only 9 years old, was to be king. But even before the ink dried on the death announcement, The courtiers were whispering the same doubt. Could the fragile boy of 9 carry the weight of a man who had moved heaven and earth, and then drowned in it? Edward was delicate from birth, thin, pâle, polite to the point of silence. He was everything his father had never been. The boy had grown up in the shadow of plague and paranoia. His mother dead before he could remember her. His father's face, a red-veined mask of fury and rot. The tutors who trained him in Latin and theology described him as brilliant but joyless. A mind hungry for control over a body, too weak to keep up. When Henry's will was finally read aloud, naming the boy king, those in the room said Edward did not smile. He bowed his head and whispered a single prayer for his father's soul. But perhaps, deep inside, he already knew that he had inherited not a kingdom, but a course. The coronation that followed weeks later felt more like a ritual to keep ghosts at bay than a celebration. The trumpets blared. The crowds cheered. The banners of gold and scarlet fluttered against the February wind, but the child on the throne looked lost inside his robes, the crown slipping slightly over his brow. A king in name, a child in body, and an heir to a legacy of blood. Those who had survived Henry's court now circled Edward like carrion birds. Edward Seymour, Jane's brother, became Lord Protector, ruling in the boy's name, but with the hunger of a man who had watched too many heads fall. The court that had once bent in fear before Henry, now bent in calculation before Edward. Alliances shifted, promises broke, and somewhere in the marble corridors, Catherine Parr, the last queen, the one who had survived, packed her things quietly and left the palace, taking with her the last trace of warmth that might have lived there. But Henry's ghost lingered, even without flesh to contain it. His portrait still hung in every hall, his face flushed with impossible life, his eyes bright with the madness of youth. At night, guards reported hearing footsteps in the king's chamber. A chair creaked, as if someone had just sat down. Once, a page swore he saw a shadow the size of a giant standing before the cold fireplace, hands clasped behind its back, as though inspecting its own kingdom from beyond the grave. Perhaps it was the wind. Perhaps it was guilt taking form. Meanwhile, Edward VI, despite his fragile frame, ruled with a surprising severity that reminded many of his father. He was sharp with his ministers, demanding obedience, intolerant of dissent. He spoke of purity, of God's will, of the need to cleanse England of sin. And yet, every time he fell ill, and that was often, the court grew pale with fear. Each cough echoed like an omen. Each fever reminded them that the Tudor line was a thin, fraying thread tied to the memory of a man who had destroyed everything to weave it. In the year 1553, after only 6 years on the throne, the boy king's health broke completely. He wasted away in his bed at Greenwich, coughing blood into his handkerchiefs. The courtiers whispered prayers for his recovery, but prepared their succession plans all the same. Edward, barely 15, spent his final days surrounded by ministers arguing over who should follow him. His father had long since rotted in his coffin, and yet it was said that Edward, in his delirium, called for him. "Father," he gasped one night, his voice thin as smoke. "I have done what you asked. I have kept the faith. Why won't you come?" But of course, Henry never came. When Edward finally died, London did not mourn the way it had for Henry. There were no lavish processions, no roaring cannons, no outpouring of grief. The city merely held its breath, as though bracing for what would come next. And what came next was a storm that even Henry, in all his wrath, could not have foreseen. For the crown that had crushed so many women now passed to one of them, Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the woman Henry had banished and left to die alone, rode through the gates of London with fire in her heart. She was no child. She was no pawn. She was the living echo of her mother's defiance. And her first act as queen was to restore the faith her father had broken. England, once torn from Rome by Henry's lust, now bent back toward it in a wave of blood. Bishops who had mocked the Pope were burned at the stake. Priests who refused the old prayers were dragged through the streets. Mary called it justice. The people called it vengeance. And through it all, she prayed for the soul of her father, the man who had taught her that love could be cruelty wearing a crown. But Mary's reign, too, was brief. As though the curse that began with Catherine's deathbed, whisper maledicta, cursed, still lingered in the royal blood. She died without heirs. Her body wasted. Her heart broken by the same dream that had destroyed her father, the dream of a son. The curse had come full circle. The throne built on the deaths of women could not be sustained by men. And when the next queen rose, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth, England finally seemed to exhale, as if the storm had at last burned itself out. Yet even Elizabeth, brilliant and indomitable, carried her father's shadow wherever she went. She ruled with steel and brilliance. But she never married, never bore children, never risked repeating the tragedy that had birthed her. She spoke of Henry rarely, and when she did, her voice would harden, the light dim in her eyes. Perhaps she had forgiven him, or perhaps forgiveness was just another kind of silence. By the time the century turned, Henry VIII was long gone, his palaces stripped, his churches rebuilt, his bones sealed within cold marble beside Jane Seymour's, but the curse he had crafted lived on in the lineage he left behind. The boy he had killed 2 wives to obtain died before manhood. The daughter he had scorned became queen only to drown her realm in fire. And the daughter he had nearly erased carved her name into eternity with solitude. The Tudor dynasty would shine like a dying star, brilliant, brief, and doomed. And somewhere beneath St. Sixlover, George's chapel at Windsor, where Henry's coffin lies beside Jane's, there is a crack in the stone that still leaks a faint, dark stain after heavy rain. The guides say it is only moisture. The scholars say it is nothing. But the servants who tend the chapel at night swear they have heard dripping that sounds too steady, too deliberate. They say it is the echo of the blood that bought the throne. And sometimes, when the moonlight slips through the stained glass just right, it glimmers across the marble lid of Henry's tomb and looks, for an instant, like tears. There are kings who die and are mourned, and kings who die and are forgotten. But Henry VIII, he did not vanish into the quiet like the others. He lingered, not in flesh, for his body had long since been devoured by worms and rot, but in silence, in shadow, in the places where memory refuses to die, long after his heart stopped beating on that frozen morning of January the 28th. In the year 1547, Henry did not rest. He haunted, not just palaces or corridors or chapels, but the very idea of England itself. The courtiers who had once served him grew old quickly. Those who had bowed, begged, betrayed, and survived did not speak his name in reverence. They whispered it behind doors, lowered their voices in candlelight, and changed the subject when his portrait caught the corner of their eyes, because there was something about the way those painted eyes followed you, piercing, pétulant, swollen with pride and loneliness, that made even the most powerful men feel like trembling boys again. And perhaps that was the truest form of his immortality, not glory, not legacy, but fear. In Hampton Court, where he once danced through gilded halls and fed his lovers grapes from golden platters, the echoes remained. Visitors in later centuries reported strange things. Candles extinguished themselves in the chapel royal. Footsteps followed them through the king's apartments. Though the hall was empty, some swore they heard music, faint and lilting. Like the tunes Henry once composed himself, only no musicians were there. But it was in the haunted gallery, the same corridor where Catherine Howard had screamed for her life, that the legend grew deepest. Women reported icy hands brushing their shoulders. Men fled in panic, claiming to see a pale figure in white, mouth open mid-scream, running endlessly toward the chapel, always just out of reach, and always just behind her. Another presence, broader, slower, heavier, watching. They say the king returns to that hall each year on the night of Catherine's death, not to chase her, not to punish her, but to witness again the moment he stopped being a man. No amount of incense or ceremony could erase what Henry had become in his final years. Not even Elizabeth, his daughter, the last and greatest Tudor monarch, could cleanse the royal line of the stain he left. Though she rarely spoke of her father, it was known that she kept one of his rings hidden among her jewels, locked in a blackened chest. Sometimes, when alone, she would trace her fingers over it, not with love, but with the aching weight of legacy. She had his eyes, his temper, his voice, but she never married, never trusted love, never bore a child. Perhaps she knew that to do so would open the gates again to obsession, to betrayal, to death. She ruled longer than any Tudor before her, and when she died in the year 1603, the Tudor line died with her. No sons, no heirs, only ghosts. And so the crown passed to another house. The portraits of Henry were moved to less prominent walls. His name was removed from toasts. His favorite songs were forgotten. But history, like the dead, does not rest quietly when it is unavenged. Century later, in the year 1812, during renovations at St. George's Chapel, the workers uncovered Henry's coffin. It had cracked, the stone lid, and meant to keep him sealed for eternity. Out split open, inside, the body had collapsed into itself. Bones scattered, wrapped in what remained of royal cloth. Next to him, the remains of Jane Seymour, untouched, peaceful. But Henry's side of the tomb was smeared with something black, too old to test, too thick to name. And then came the second whisper, not of haunting, but of judgment. The scholars began to ask, what had it all been for? A boy king who died at 15, a church torn from Rome and then twisted into weaponry, 6 wives, 2 decapitated, hundreds of executions, the dissolution of monasteries, the martyrdom of saints, the destruction of art and scripture, a kingdom ruled by appetite. Was this greatness, or simply madness in a crown? And yet the name endured. In the schoolbooks, the rhyme was neat: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But beneath each word was a scream, a prayer, a hand reaching through time, trying to be remembered not as part of a jingle, but as a human being who bled. Henry VIII is now a lesson, a symbol, a cautionary tale. But the real man, the boy who loved music, the prince who adored his first queen, The king who wrote love letters in shaky Latin, he has been buried under the mountain of his own sins. All that remains are shadows and echoes, and sometimes something more. There is a tradition, still observed in secret by the oldest caretakers of Windsor Castle. On the night of January the 28th, they walk the halls just before midnight, stopping before the door of the chapel where Henry lies, entombed. They light a single candle. They speak no words. And they listen. Not for voices. Not for moans or footsteps or the clatter of a sword. They listen for breath. Just one. Because if you listen carefully, they say, you can hear it. Heavy. Labored. Like a man who has not yet finished speaking. In the end, Henry VIII did not win, though he ruled with fists full of parchment, laws inked in his name, and swords drawn in his will, though he silenced popes and burned saints, rewrote scripture, and crowned and uncrowned queens like a child tearing petals from a flower. He lost. He lost in the way that only tyrants lose slowly, silently, and forever. For even as his body was lowered into the stone vault beneath St. George's Chapel, wrapped in cloth, still damp with the oils of desperation, it was not his glory that echoed through the ages. It was their names: Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. He called himself their husband, their king, their destiny, but it was they who shaped his legacy, each with their silence, their screams, their dying breath, and history, merciless. Memory-soaked history, remembered them not as wives of a king, but as witnesses to a man who forgot how to love. Catherine of Aragon was the first, and perhaps the truest. For 24 years, she shared his throne, his bed, his triumphs. She prayed for him when he left her. She withered in cold stone chambers, barred from her daughter, abandoned, but never bitter. And when she died alone, thin, dressed in black, her final word was a curse, whispered not from hatred, but from broken-hearted truth. Maledicta. Cursed. She had seen what the world refused to, that the man she had loved had already begun to rot inside. Anne Boleyn came with fire. She dazzled, danced, and denied. She held a mirror to his power and made him hunger. She demanded a crown or nothing, and he broke a nation to give it to her. But when her womb failed to give him a son, he broke her neck as easily as he had broken England's tie to Rome. Her final words prayed for the man who betrayed her, even as the sword flashed in the morning light. And yet it was her child, not her husband, who would reign in brilliance. Jane Seymour was quiet, gentle, obedient. She gave him the son he had killed for, and died for it. Henry called her his one true queen, and had himself buried beside her, yet he never knew his son would die at 15. Wasted. Coughing blood into silk. The price of Jane's life was the brief reign of a boy already doomed. Anne of Cleves survived. Clever, kind, and unthreatening. She outlived them all. She watched him recoil at her face, mock her body, dissolve the marriage in a heartbeat. And yet, by doing nothing, by staying silent, by walking away with dignity and gold, she won the one thing the others never got: freedom. She lived peacefully, laughed in the gardens, and never saw the inside of the tower. Catherine Howard never had the chance. Barely 19. Swept into a marriage with a man 5 times her age. A man whose body bled as he walked, whose breath stank of death She was a child who had once kissed boys in secret gardens, who never understood that the king's love was a noose. And when her laughter turned to terror, when her flirtations became evidence, she was dragged to the same place. Her cousin Anne had died. They said she screamed all the way down the haunted corridor, begging for mercy from a man who had already forgotten how to give it. She died, begging to lay her head on the executioner's block, as though it were her lover's chest. And then, at the very end, Catherine Parr, the nurse, the scholar, the survivor, she read scripture to him in his final nights. She washed the stinking leg no one else could bear. She kept his daughters close, soothed his mad fits, dodged his paranoia. She lived through him, and then beyond him, and when he finally died, she walked away, quiet, whole, alive. Together, they were not a harem, not footnotes, not rhyming curiosities in schoolhouse songs. They were his mirror, cracked and stained. They were the proof that the greatest power in the world cannot force a man to love, to listen, to change. Henry tried to shape them into symbols, wombs to carry heirs, chess pieces in his war against time. But they resisted. In their own way. Each one did. And so he destroyed them, one by one, until nothing was left but the echo of their names, whispered not in palaces, but in the pages of books, in the flickering of candles, in the silent judgment of the generations that followed. And what of Henry? He lies beneath cold stone, beside Jane, the wife who died before she could disappoint him. His tomb is sealed, yet cracked. His body, once so mighty, burst and bled in its coffin. The wooden panels had to be reinforced. The smell could not be contained. Century later, when the vault was disturbed during renovations, the walls were stained black where his corpse had leaked into the stone. A king, who once silenced all dissent, could not stop his body from oozing through marble. Even in death, he rots. Even in legend, he bleeds. And above him, history continues. Elizabeth I ruled for 44 years. She reigned alone, refusing every suitor, building an empire in her mother's name. She survived plague, invasion, betrayal, and in the end, they called her Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, but never the daughter of a murderer. Mary, daughter of Catherine, ruled with fire. Her reign was brief and bloody. They called her Bloody Mary, but perhaps it was simply the echo of her mother's rage rising after decades of being erased. Edward ruled and died, a flicker, a ghost in a child's body. His father's obsession made flesh, and then extinguished. And Henry he endures, not in the glory he imagined, not in statues or sonnets, but in the way his story tastes bitter on the tongue, in the way people shudder when they speak of Anne's execution, or Catherine's scream, or Jane's key at deathbed, in the way his face in the portrait halls stares back not with majesty, but with accusation. He was loved by 6 women, and he killed that love. Every time. That is his legacy. And that is the curse. For kings die, but guilt lives longer, and memory true, sharp, and merciless remembers the women, not for how they died, but for how they outlived him.